And thank you so much, Sven, for that fantastic introduction. I hope I live up to expectations. So I represent the Adaptation Fund. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Adaptation Fund, it finances concrete adaptation projects and programs in countries that are vulnerable to climate change. And it's got over $1 billion, I think, that it's spent so far on 200 plus projects with another $1 billion in the pipeline. So really important fund. And I represent the evaluation function of that fund, which is the Technical Evaluation Reference Group, which we fondly call the AF-TERG. So if you hear me saying AF-TERG, you know what it is now. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk today about ex-post evaluations and to see how the AF-TERG is applying that in our work. So we all know, we're hearing this, over and over again, that climate finance is such a precious resource. And project launches are such an exciting time for everybody when the funds become available, design is also full of enthusiasm, and so is implementation. And at the completion, we have these fantastic reports that show marvelous results. However, there might not be incentives in place to show what results last after the project closes, who continues to benefit, how resilience is built for communities in the face of climate change. So what happens when project teams pack up? Funding runs out, everyone goes away, and all the support disappears. This is a critical question, not just for the Adaptation Fund, but for the broader adaptation community as a whole. The latest adaptation gap report also, sorry, next, I just click on it. Yep, okay, lovely. Just stay on that. Okay, so the latest adaptation gap report also underscores this challenge. 172 out of 197 countries worldwide have a national adaptation plan strategy or policy in place. The BTRs, which is the biannual transparent reports, also indicate there's progress in implementing adaptation measures. I believe there's about 1,600 of them. But the adaptation gap report also recognizes that these reported results tend to be at the output level, for instance, how many people trained, rather than talking about lasting outcomes. Next slide, please. To get to the bottom of these issues, the Adaptation Fund Board has asked the AF-TERG to use a new methodology for us, ex-post evaluations, particularly in the climate adaptation space, to think about post-implementation learning and how we can use that across the fund's projects and programs so that we improve and learn as we go along. So what is an ex-post evaluation? This is a formal assessment which is conducted 3 to 5 years after the project has closed, right? To see what its lasting contribution is. So we like to think about it as a learning journey, or some people think about it as, we are playing detective in the field, different interpretations, where the evaluators go to the project site 3 to 5 years after everything has finished, and we look for clues or evidence on what results or benefits have sustained, what didn't sustain behind that. We also look at project outcomes and how that's contributing to communities' resilience to climate change. So what does the methodology actually entail? Firstly, we look at what project outcomes have evolved or sustained over time. We looked at the factors that enabled or support these outcomes to sustain. And we then analyze the impact by seeing how these outcomes are helping to enhance broader system resilience. So I'd like to reflect on 3 things that are emerging. We've only done 6 so far, so it's a very small pool. Yesterday, I was very happy to help launch the next 2, number 7 and 8 of the ex-post evaluations for Ghana and Cuba at the Adaptation Fund, the 4 funds pavilion down there. So we're still learning as we go along. So the first reflection is it's really important for communities and people to be involved in the project for it to sustain. Please. I'm going to give you an example from a project that closed in Ecuador and compare 2 sites. So in one site on Nabon, on the left-hand side, it installed new water lines to support family orchards, and this was intended to help food security of that area. It sounded like a great idea, but then a landslide hit and people began to leave and the orchards were abandoned. So this is a little bit of a ghostly story when everybody left and there was no one there and the orchards were not maintained. But then there's a happy story from a province close by called Cochapata, which is the one on the right. And the story is very different here because the community restored a set of communal reservoirs, and the results there were remarkable. So the people of Kochapata took ownership from the very beginning. They didn't just participate, they led, got involved in all processes. They formalized their commitments by creating a local water committee and organizing volunteer meets at least twice a year to maintain the system. So there was a strong sense of ownership, and that's exactly why water is still flowing and farms are thriving in Kochapata, whereas Nabon is ghostly. Next slide, please. So we see the same pattern, and I'm not going to dwell on this too much because my colleague Richard here is going to talk about this a bit more, but we're seeing the same thing in a recently conducted evaluation, ex-post evaluation in Mauritania. Here, the projects helped to start several small businesses, local shops, and community gardens. And 5 years later, we also found that the ones that were being run by local women's cooperatives tended to be still going strong. In fact, 96% of people who are still involved in these businesses say that their income has gone up and food security has gone up, and it all comes down to ownership. These groups had deep community groups, and critically, they had direct control over their businesses and the money they made. There's also an example of an unsuccessful planting vegetation that's slightly misleading because during the project period, it actually helped in soil stabilization, dune stabilization, in fodder for animals in protected areas, etc. But after the project closed, it was unsuccessful because there was no maintenance. So maintenance is key. Next slide, please. This brings us to our second major insight. I've already said it. Maintenance is, sorry, next one. Maintenance is key. We've got to keep it running. And despite community ownership, there's the issue of physical infrastructure, of keeping tangible assets and equipment in good running condition. All too often, new and sophisticated hardware is installed without addressing the fundamental question of who will be responsible for maintaining and repairing it when it fails, and how will these costs be covered? Next slide, please. This is another one, another experience from Argentina. And this shows the point clearly, where the country invested in 11 state-of-the-art hydromet stations, water and weather stations. It was designed to provide farmers with essential climate risk information. And this was quite an impressive initiative. However, a few years later, only half of these stations were operational. In 2 stations, cattle had damaged the fencing. Another station had overgrown vegetation, and 2 others were not transmitting data because they were using obsolete 2G technology. Next slide, please. So why was there mixed success? When we looked at this closely, it came down to 3 factors. Firstly, nobody had allocated money for ongoing maintenance after the project finished. Secondly, there was lack of clarity on who was responsible for performing the maintenance. And thirdly, the agency that was designated to oversee the system was based hundreds of miles away, resulting in complete disconnect from local realities. However, there's a positive story as well. The Met stations that were working had good ownership. These weather stations that continued to operate effectively were managed by a local agency with personnel on the ground and a well-defined maintenance plan. They continued to provide valuable hydromet and technical information to farmers in need of production data and advice across the region that was studied. And in fact, during the evaluation, over half of those that were interviewed noted that the information that they got from these early warning systems improved their response to climate shocks. Farmers said that they had adopted improved agricultural practices because the information that they were getting from these weather stations had helped them to choose new planting dates. They were able to understand variations in precipitation, and that they were better informed on best agricultural practices, for instance, looking at perennial cropping on their lands. Slide, please. The same dynamic shows up on another ex-post in Samoa. And again, there's 2 stories here to tell. The seawall on the left is a real success because years later, it's still standing strong, no major issues. Why? Because there's a formal agreement in place for its upkeep. There's a genuine partnership here between the local village and the government, and everyone understands the role. And it's worked so well that the local people even use it as a walk for leisure. But on the other side, just a few miles away, it's a very different picture. The Salimu Masumusu rock wall is not fulfilling its intended purpose. And as you can see from the picture over there, there's water pooling on the road that it was built to protect. So the lesson here, I'm going to re-emphasize this again, without a clear, funded and local maintenance plan, even the strongest wall will eventually crumble. So we need to build this on, I mean, this is another reflection. We need to be thinking about these issues at the beginning during design and not at the end. And these lessons would seem like common sense to most of us, right? It's the evaluation shouldn't be picking up these commonsensical things. Yet we're making the same mistakes over and over again, or we're not learning, putting it differently. Next slide, please. So we've got ownership, we've got maintenance, and now I'm sure all of us have faced this in life, the unexpected. How do you deal with that? What happens when there's a twist in the plot? What happens when something completely unexpected hits the project? And I want to go back to the same Nabon project that I was talking about earlier in Ecuador. So the project, if you remember, set up these water lines and orchards in 2018. Everything was working. But in 2021, there was a massive landslide. The shock that had nothing to do with the original project. Nobody could anticipate that. And it completely wiped out their water source. Just like that, the entire foundation of the project was wiped away. At the same time, as you're all aware, COVID hit. So families decided to migrate, and they were migrating for economic reasons, and they abandoned their orchards. So this is such a critical point, because real resilience isn't just about building walls or planting trees for the storm that you can predict. It's about building capacity and the human ability to adapt, respond, and build when something completely unexpected knocks you down. And I think this is such a critical lesson. And there will be different examples of how to do this across different projects and different contexts. So this requires a lot of thinking and action for communities, institutions, ecosystems, and economies, thinking more about a system-wide approach. And this can involve a lot of measures, for instance, interpreting and using climate information earlier on in your planning and daily decision-making. It could be training in climate-smart practices. It could be use of scientific and traditional knowledge, coordination, and I made this point earlier, vertical coordination across ministries, from local levels right through to the ministries, but also horizontally across departments and ministries so that there is better coordination. Strengthening community networks. And I think for the Mauritania project particularly, we see that NGOs stepped in, and that was really instrumental in continuing community networks and sustaining project loops. And then, of course, I belong to the evaluation department, so I'm going to say feedback loops through monitoring and evaluation and learning for continuous learning and improvement is absolutely critical. And I'm sure my friend Archie and Melvin over there will agree with me wholeheartedly. So just to summarize these three reflections again, start with genuine community ownership. Don't just show up, ask for input, but empower people to lead from day one. Ensure that communities have a direct stake, are engaged, and can benefit from project interventions. And I would emphasize in a very equitable and inclusive manner. Secondly, create a rock-solid maintenance plan. Before the ribbon cutting, we should already know who's going to fix it. Do capacities indeed exist? Can parts be sourced? And who's going to pay for all this once the project ends? And thirdly, plan for the unexpected. True resilience means building the flexibility to hand the curveballs you can't see coming. I'm nearly at the end, so sorry, you're going to have to listen to me for a little while longer, but next slide, please. So I just want to reflect on the relevance of these expos. And you mentioned the points, Sven, earlier. It's quite difficult to do these, and I would agree actually, because who pays for these? The project's over. What's the incentive for it? And I think for us, the AF-TERG is paying for these ourselves, and the board has set aside, given us the mandate to go ahead with these. We do about 2 a year at the moment. So I think the relevance of expos is critical because it helps us to learn and guide the next phase of project development, or even, next slide, please, sorry, take things to scale and to capture maladaptation or unintended consequences early on. So before we go to the next phase of project development, at least you've got some learning coming out on what worked in a particular context and why, and what didn't work. So that helps us learn. It helps with upward and downward accountability. Most of the times we're focused on reporting to donors because donors pay. So yes, these are the results that were generated. but don't we owe it to the communities as well, where we're doing these projects? We're trying to shift practices. We're training them. We're making them, getting them to think about new ways, shifting new ways of doing things. So I think this is really important. And it's also important for building trust with communities, because sometimes you come in, you do a project, and then communities are not convinced, they don't take that up. So I think that's really, really important to think about. And I don't want to oversell the last point, but I think, we're here at COP30, and there's a lot of discussions going on about the global goal on adaptation, the indicators, how we're all contributing to building longer term adaptation and resilience. And so I think some of these learnings could get countries to think about these issues, as they go into the discussions, and the ambition of what they want to achieve in their countries on adaptation. And then, of course, it's also relevant for the evaluation community at large. We are learning as we go along, and it's great to be talking to other colleagues who are also working in this area. There are few, but we're working alongside them. And yeah, so far, as I said, we've done 6 expos, 2 more were launched yesterday, and we hope to do another 2 next year. And thank you so much for your kind attention. Thank you to everyone online as well for participating in this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. And do a slight change of play here, because we have a nice crowd here in the audience. So I wanted to see whether from your side there are any comments, reflections, questions that you want to share based on Debbie's presentation. So it could be, for instance, those 3 takeaways. Are they surprising to you? Is there anything new there, or why haven't we learned? And also on the value of exposed evaluations and going back. And I see there's the first comment. Please, sir, and please state your name and affiliation.
Hello, my name is Mao Amis. I'm the Executive Director of the African Center for Green Economy, a think tank that is based in South Africa. My is more of a question in terms of how do you input some of these results from the evaluation into the design of the project, so that the same mistakes that are encountered in the projects are not encountered again. And also, how do you interface with the project implementers to be able to take some of these findings from our evaluations into consideration? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Melvin Wong from KfW's Evaluation Department. On the point on maintenance, I also made the experience that like, what's going on? Like, why do we always have this problem with maintenance? And I figured out that maybe it's also not something of unwillingness, but inability sometimes, because you have sometimes when you do the maintenance, you need also the So I figured out that it might not be something of unwillingness, but maybe inability more, because you are taking money, then it's gone, and then you need to replenish how to do this, and then people, they don't have enough means anymore. So you need to kind of like a fund that's kind of giving yield and so on, and then it gets bigger and bigger and more complicated. I'm not sure. Maybe you have an answer or not, but for maintenance, do you have a suggestion out of the evaluations? What could have been done differently in order then to have this kind of flow of money then? Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. I'm going to take yours first. You were asking about, how these results are fed back into programming. What are the methods to do that? So we're the evaluation department. We sit separately from the secretariat that, supports the implementation of it. So for us, we present these findings to the board, and we also give them to the secretariat, and that gets reflected in lesson learning documents, in discussions with the implementing entities, and in design of new programs, right? So there's a lot of interest from the Adaptation Fund board and from the Adaptation Fund secretariat to actually take on board these lessons. So this is seen as quite a flagship initiative for the Adaptation Fund in taking that forward. But what we also do, once the evaluators have done this, we go back and we discuss the findings with the implementing entities, and because I think it's our responsibility not just to come in and evaluate and then go away with our findings in a briefcase, but we actually want to engage people. So we go back and we talk to them about that. I hope that answers your question. Okay. And I have to confess, we're getting better at this. We've only done 6, but we're very, very keen that the results and the lessons are taken on board in cycled up programming or in scaling up. And Melvin, you were asking about maintenance, and there are different ways of doing this. In some cases, the local institutions or the project entities, will actually create a maintenance fund. In other cases, we've seen where communities have actually done this. So where communities have been trained, for instance, in how to repair water cisterns that were created by the project fund, and communities are now operating that, contributing to that because they're seeing the thing is the communities need to see the benefits of this. If they don't see the benefits, why would they put money into this, right? So benefits need to be there. Benefits need to be visible for communities to be incentivized or for local institutions. So it really depends on the context, I would say. But I think for me, you need to see the results sustaining to incentivize continued engagement. And you also need to be thinking about these things in design. So I would actually put in some money, personally, I would make sure that the project actually has some sort of maintenance plan, at least for the next 2-3 years, so that it can then start to become self-sustaining with local communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. And well, now we have the pleasure also that Jens Siegmund joined us. We knew that you had a previous appointment, and you missed Debbie's fantastic presentation on lessons learned from ex-post evaluations of Adaptation Fund projects. But we just started with sort of a first round of questions on how can we learn from those types of evaluations. So now we can move on, and I'd like to invite Richard first to join us here with some reflections from your work at the World Food Programme, how the World Food Programme uses evidence from evaluations to inform your decisions and to improve your programs. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I thought your question was a planned directly for me, because that's really what I'm thinking about. No, thanks very much for asking me to come to this event today. I've already learned so much. You mentioned that I've recently come from the private sector, but I really feel like I've been in a time capsule. I am the current director of climate at the World Food Programme, but I'm also the second to last climate director at the World Food Programme. I've been out for 9 years. But before that, I led our accreditation to the Adaptation Fund and the Green Climate Fund. I led the design of 2 of the projects that you've seen ex post evaluated. I didn't know that before this session, by the way. And so for me, it's like coming back 9 years afterwards and saying, oh, what happened? And I think for many of us who have been working in adaptation for a long time. I started my career working in disaster risk reduction, and I quickly became thinking about how to prepare for the changing climate and how to do adaptation at the community level. I think when we started designing these projects and working with communities and governments to understand really what adaptation means, we had a lot of questions about what works and what doesn't work. And I think there's a whole set of lessons that have emerged. Some are project and developments generic lessons. I think a lot of the issues around maintenance, for example, are not adaptation specific, and some are adaptation and resilience specific. So for example, the mudslide example in Ecuador is a great example of where we design projects to be robust but fragile, as opposed to resilient, to borrow from our ecological resilience colleagues, strong against one hazard but ignoring others and easy to break. So just to say that's a really important thing. I think when we started thinking about adaptation too, we were also in WFP really concerned about what we were seeing in the places most affected by climate change and recurrent food crises. we're the largest humanitarian organization in the world, but we have a mandate which includes reducing and preparing for disasters, responding to them, and then building long-term food security and nutrition. So we try to look across all of those things. The ex-post evaluations are critical because we go in, we do an intervention, we work really hard, we try to increase program quality, but we don't always know what happens next, and that I think is critical. So we've been using both ex-post evaluations and also experimental methods in evaluation, randomized controlled trials, and those other quasi-experimental methods to really try and understand what's working and what's not working, and particularly what drives outcomes. For us, that means food security and income and nutrition outcomes, but within a larger context. So building on what we've heard already, there's a few, I think, critical things that we're continuing to learn and focus on. One is, of course, that context matters. What we've seen in our evaluations is that adaptation to climate change is effective when implementation is tailored to local risks, local governance systems, and community priorities. A one-size-fits-all rarely delivers. And that means doing things like, for example, meaningful community-based design and planning of projects. The discussion we've just had about maintenance, I heard a lot of really important things like making sure there's a plan at the end of a project. But to be honest, the first and most important thing is engaging the community in the design from the beginning. I was just in Wajir, Kenya, and I was driving to a community where we're working, and I saw I can't even count the number of sites where there was drip irrigation tubing just lying there on the side of the road, where partners had, probably including WFP, tried to use drip irrigation for horticulture and to help pastoral communities who have lost all their livestock enter into agriculture. And then I got to another community where we were working, and we had decided to do a community-based design of the irrigation system there. And the community knew. They were like, no, we don't want drip irrigation. And so we designed a combination of tube irrigation to sluice irrigation to reduce evaporation, but simple flood irrigation in vegetable patches. No risk that would get clogged up and silted up, which is the problem in that area with drip irrigation. So I think that kind of from the beginning design of a project that's context specific, that involves communities from the design stage as opposed to just the implementation stage, is really critical. Second, what we're seeing consistently, and I think we know this, is that integrated approaches work best. And in part, that's because when you work at the community level to design a project, they don't see things as agriculture and water and livestock and health. They see it as life in the climate that they live in. And so that really is starting to show. And we're seeing that, for example, in the randomized control trials we're doing, and you see it in the ex-post evaluations, that a combination of food security programs that build on ecosystems restoration and livelihoods really generate results. And I think that comes back to also something that we saw in Mauritania. One of the things that made the women's group successful is they saw rapid results from the activity, which generated momentum and buy-in. And so that I think is really critical. Flexibility is critical. We're seeing that, and I think the examples we've already seen show that really well. And then the timing of support also is critical. We found in our evaluations significant kind of shifts in the effectiveness of programs depending on when they're provided, and also significant differences in the results. So, for example, in a lot of our adaptation and resilience building work, what we find is a significant benefit for participants right after the harvest. But the difference between the control and treatment group in evaluation terms often diminishes later on in the lean season in rural areas. So it's really important to kind of understand those timing dynamics in the design of the program so that we think through and work through with the community how to make sure those are there. And then capacity strengthening, obviously we've talked about that. It's critical to build capacity, especially at the local and institutional level, because without that capacity, you can't be flexible unless you understand the context, unless you understand in this conversation the dynamics of the climate and weather and how it's changing, and also the dynamics of livelihoods and markets and those things. You can't really adapt and be flexible and find new pathways and absorb the learning. So that capacity building is really, really essential. So I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Yeah, before we move on to Jens, just a quick check. Any questions? Yes, there is. Let me just walk over.
Hello, my name is Sharp Turji, and I'm a master's student at Yale, doing my master's in environmental management and public policy. I'm also a Bhutan delegate. Sorry, brain's not working. And adaptation is very top of mind here, both in like the professional and personal like realm. And I feel like a lot of adaptation and development projects adopt a rather homogenous definition of what community means, when in fact there are lots of interest groups with very different motivations and incentives to make this work. So how, in your experience as practitioners and evaluators, have you accounted for all these interests, or when you go about utilizing a more community-based design approach?
Well, that is such a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think there's several things that we really try to do in that process. In our kind of standard program design process, we have three kind of layers of work that we do. The first is we, at the national level, do an analysis of the interactions between food security, nutrition, climate risks, land degradation, and other risks, conflict, marginalization, gender, and really try to understand those dynamics with our national counterparts. And we use that to target the areas that are most food insecure because of exposure to risk. We then convene at the local level, and so that could be the municipal level or the district level. And what we try to do is convene community leaders, recognizing the representation from communities is important in itself, particularly in terms of gender or ethnic groups or other kind of groups, and try to make sure that we're inclusive in that process, but also institutions, national government, ministry representatives, civil society, and other groups working together. And we have a framework that we call the seasonal livelihoods planning approach, which maps out with those stakeholders the seasonality of climate and livelihoods, but also the seasonality of stress. Like when are women and girls spending 6 hours a day collecting water? When are they out collecting firewood and exposed to sexual violence? When are these kind of negative outcomes prevalent? And then we use that as a way to kind of try and bring everyone together in a local vision of how to address the impacts of climate shocks and other shocks. We do that analysis actually for a good year and a bad year to try and make sure that we're thinking like what happens during a drought period where that stress is more. Then with those stakeholders, we go to the community level, and all of our actual planning at the community level is done through participatory approaches, which are designed to be inclusive. And of course, that's difficult. So we try to make sure that there's that the staff doing that are representative of the local population whenever possible, bearing in mind, we work in a lot of conflict zones where those dynamics are very difficult. There's gender representation, and do that in a way that really empowers particularly marginalized members of the community to have a voice in that process. So there isn't kind of local elite capture in the process. So that's very much a kind of part of our process. And what we find
Richard, I hear that you're really excited about this project and approach, but we need to move on.
Yes,
apologies. So Jens, welcome. So for those of you here in the audience, Jens Sedemund is the Director of Climate and Environment at the OECD Development Cooperation Secretariat. You spent 22 years, 20 plus years at the OECD in many different roles. What makes it really interesting that you're here is that I read from your bio that you were in several sort of very high advisory roles, senior advisory roles. So perhaps you can not only reflect on how OECD uses evidence for climate action, but push some of us here in the audience who are researchers, evaluators, push us how can we deliver evidence that in your position or in similar position as yours become useful. So please tell us also not only how the OECD uses this right now, but what do you need to use even more evidence? And please be bold and provocative.
My best. Let's see how I can live up to that. But maybe first to say, OECD is an organization that is focused on policy advice, evidence analysis. So evidence is absolutely central to what we do. And let me just say that I think in the context of this discussion, we are in a decade of action, and accountability for impact is really everything. It's not enough. And I think we hear that a lot. Yes, effort is important. You need to have more effort. But at the end of the day, what matters are the outcomes. And so it's absolutely critical. I think it's very clear we need to learn faster and better because it's a rapidly evolving situation and the context changes a lot. And I think the critical thing also about evidence and evaluations is that we really don't have time and resources to waste money on things that don't work. And actually, with regard to speed and the ability to act, it's essential that we use evaluations. At the same time, I guess everybody recognizes it's a transformational process. There are lots of unknowns. There are lots of unintended effects. And again, I think evaluation has a critical role to play in both supporting national and local actions and enabling good international support. Now, what we see from some innovations, work on evaluations, and is basically some things that are quite well known. I guess still a bit of a balance towards or sort of a bias towards mitigation versus adaptation, although that's improving. I think what's really crucially coming out as well is still insufficient coordination and complementarity of actions and limited collective results. So a lot of the evaluation focuses at the project level of individual actors, and in any developing country, you have typically, let's say, dozens of international partners. So all of them are just a small piece of the puzzle. What matters at the end of the day is the outcome at the country level. That can start from small scale and be replicable and spread across, but I think that systems working approach is really critical. I think there's some key questions remaining around adaptation and the big focus on mobilization of private capital, both lots of criticism, lots of questions, at the same time a lot of opportunity. And then I think I think something that we've heard before, and I'm going to make the point again, that evaluations need to be designed with end users in mind, so that basically the findings really can be taken up and implemented. And maybe just to say that I think one general point that resonated very much here for me was that the point on the context specificity, working with the local recipients, etc. I mean, that is absolutely central, and I think it goes back to some of the fundamental things that have been learned in development cooperation, and has been sort of encapsulated in this principle of ownership, because at the end of the day, international support is about enabling whoever's the local partner to carry something forward. That's the fundamental basis of sustainability, and of having lasting sustainable results. And that only happens if there is ownership, if people own the action that is being done. And it's very simple. You need the right technical design, and that is absolutely, that varies across according to context. But the very fundamental principle of ownership is that people will only sustain something if they're in it themselves. And I think that is the key point there. Now, I think another point really is to move beyond targets to impact measurements, as I said, I think that goes to, a bit of a move away of focusing on how much finance we deploy, and really looking at the outcomes that we see there. And current frameworks really remain too much project focused, making it difficult to do that. Now, on the maybe sort of closing a loop and trying to address some of the points that you say, I think how can this be made palatable for further policy or political adjustments? I think one thing really is to say, okay, how can we bring it back to the basics and keep it simple? Because there is a lot of complexity, and I think sometimes you need complexity at the specific project levels or so, but focusing on what are the key messages. And there I would say that one key message, if we look at adaptation, is really to bring it back to the basically development purpose of it. And if you look at the Paris Agreement, I think there's sometimes too much focus in saying we adapt to climate change, but what is the purpose of that adaptation? And that is basically sustainable development. And if whatever area you look across, if it's agriculture, it's basically the protection of safeguarding agricultural productivity with that food security, livelihoods, income growth. That's the fundamental same thing as you would have in agricultural development. If you think about health, the health effects of climate, it's about having better health system and healthier societies. Again, it's the same. If we think about, again, poverty, livelihoods, infrastructure, and really coming back to that and trying to keep a focus on these essential points, because that's what matters at the end of the day to people, and that's what matters in reality. So that would be my plea to say, let's not get hung up too much with the complexity. Yes, we need to, in each intervention, it needs to be context specific, but let's keep in mind, what is the bigger ambition, the bigger purpose here of it. And I think that is a key point to communicating, also overcoming some notions of difference still, that then helps a better, more integrated approach.
Excellent. And you must have had a sneak preview to Debbie's presentation, because I know that you didn't, but her findings, what I really liked about you was the clarity, the specificity, but also the simplicity of your recommendations, right? And oftentimes we as researchers, as evaluators, we do the opposite as you just recommended, right? I mean, in my career in the past 25 years, maybe 5% of the evaluations I saw, I worked on, proposed, recommended, said what should be done less. We're always really good in recommending, but write a new policy, write an additional guideline, add some tools, incorporate this and this and that, and rarely we make recommendations as you just said. Reduce it to the essential, make clear what problems are actually going back to the basis of sustainable development, as you said, something we've been working on for many decades now. So thank you for that. While we are not sure whether Diane and her interview with the Financial Times, I think will be able to show up. Let's see if there are any questions here from the audience again. Yeah, we've got 5 more minutes, so maybe she'll come for closing remarks. Okay, Melvin, yes, please.
Thank you. I'm Melvin from Melvin Wong from KfW Evaluation Department, and the talks were really interesting. Also, the concept of the integrated approach really resonates with me, because the benefits for the local communities, they vary, and one needs to look out for their needs in order to make it useful for them. That also then helps us to get a more sustainable kind of project as well. The problem though is it makes it more complex, right? So you have this trade-off of taking care of the needs and go really small scale, and then you have like this nitty-gritty projects versus you are very efficient, and then you have like a very lean project design, but then it doesn't really target the people. So I'm not sure. I hear maybe it's less of a question, more of a comment, that I hear mixed signals. One is to do it less complex, and the other thing is to do it more integrative and participatory, which increases the complexity, right? So it's very difficult to find the niche and the balance of this one. And I'm not sure what's the guideline there to have a good project actually.
That's such a good question. In fact, it's a question that I ask our evaluation team to help us answer all the time, because I think we've learned about how to do participatory planning. We talk about layering and sequencing. I think that's one of the key kind of like project management things we do now, and also adaptive management. And the question for us is like, what's the sequence of things that you need to do in order to get to that integrated approach? You don't have to do everything at once. Sometimes you got to do one thing, like, you know, restore a watershed before you start doing irrigated horticulture, for example. So like, that's a big question for us. What's the best, most efficient way and the fastest way to sequence activities and then layer things? Like, we all think, oh, if we put these 5 things together, that would be better. But we don't actually know. We think that's the case, but we don't actually know if those 5 things are needed, or if 3 of those things get you 90% of the result. And so I do really hope that our evaluation colleagues will help us with ex post evaluations and with other more rigorous methods to try and dig into that question. I mean, on the evaluation side, it's easier to evaluate one thing, like, is this drought tolerant seed better than this non-drought tolerant seed? Yes or no? That's kind of not an easy question, but it's an easier question than if we do drought tolerant seeds plus regenerative agriculture plus offtake and post-harvest handling plus savings groups plus, will we get a better result? So that's a really kind of more challenging dynamic to evaluate.
Many things, yeah. I'm not sure I agree. I mean, it was a comment, you know, and I think I'm not meaning to say things are super easy, but I think when I talked about the simplicity, it's about going back to the basics of the objectives and being clear in defining them and not getting lost in sort of the weeds of things. Now, I think you can have you have different projects. You may have a grid-style renewable energy project that is different to community-based projects by definition. And I think, again, what it comes back to is to say you need the proper technical specifications, but then the question is, you need that project to be sustained by your partner, and how would you get there? And I think that is key. Now, let's say infrastructure projects, they're always complex. I think in all countries, I haven't heard of an infrastructure project where there hasn't been some controversy, including in high-income countries. So I'm not saying it's easy, yeah, but it's a question. You know, you have a consultation process, everything. But the question is, how do you get that off the ground? How do you get it running? How do you make sure it's affordable, etc.? If you have a community-based project, it's very different. You're probably not addressing the same issues. You're not addressing grid scale, you know, resilient infrastructure. You're having sort of an agriculture project maybe that is more at the community level. So again, I'm not saying it's easy, but I think it's it's focusing on these core objectives that you have. I want to say something else which I'm missing now, but I think we're also running out of time.
Perhaps before we get to the closure, maybe my take on this very good question is, we also need to distinguish between reporting requirements and what we're actually doing in practice. Sometimes I have the impression that we have skilled professionals in development cooperation from all countries, and sometimes the admin burden on them to demonstrate that they are aware of the complexities are just insane, and they're sort of forced to write down, okay, this project, and it can be a simple 200,000 euros project with multiple goals, because of sort of our bureaucratic features, and sometimes the demands or recommendations from evaluators feed into this, that your project description just has like 20 different goals. And if you go by the OECD markers, you could have a secondary climate marker alongside 6-7 other secondary climate marker for a road that is being constructed. And then in the end, there's sort of being held accountable for all those things that are sort of, we produce the rules, and I think there's a real point in, for many of those skilled development professionals, just give them some slack, give them some ability to work a bit more like perhaps in the private sector, at least in my private sector experience. I felt that we had much more room for maneuvering. I didn't have to document that I would sort of complete all those those reportings and achieve 25 different contradictory goals. So sorry for that small rant here, but I think simplifying bureaucracy is important everywhere, but it's also important for development cooperation. So Debbie, not sure whether Diane is still showing up, but I'd like to pass the floor to you for some closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Sven, and thank you, everyone. Just very quickly, a reflection on that. I think you said trade-offs, and I think sometimes, the Adaptation Fund projects are country-owned and country-driven, so the proposals actually come from the countries. We also have pioneer direct access modalities, so that actually means the ideas are coming there rather than being top-down. And we've now recently had a locally led adaptation window as well last year that was opened up. So that again gives communities, the opportunity to create and develop things on their own. But one of the issues that often comes up is, sort of trade-offs, agriculture, water, ecosystems, or, so there's several trade-offs, and that needs to be figured out. So if you have development projects, for instance, so this is purely adaptation projects, and I think that's really important. That's where the money is going from the Adaptation Fund. I think we need to be clear about that. Although there are integrated approaches that look at wider benefits. The second issue is about coordination with different ministries, and that's often such a challenge. You don't get that easily on the ground, or even at national levels, because if one particular ministry is the designated authority and it falls within them, then it becomes very difficult for others to sort of get involved. So I think that there are a number of factors. It's very context specific. But I think I just wanted to thank you, Sven, for your excellent moderation, and to thank all the panelists. And I'm sorry Diane wasn't able to join us. And I'd just like to say one sentence, which is evidence for climate action, which is the pavilion name. Experts are one way of doing that. We're starting with this, and we hope that this will continue to provide more evidence, which is hugely critical as climate resources are stretched, and we need to make the best out of the money that we have, and really make sure that it's going to benefit the people that it's meant to benefit, which is vulnerable communities, and that these benefits sustain over time. The money is not just temporarily providing some fixes, but it's actually helping to create resilience and build adaptive capacity. Thank you. Thank you very much to everybody who's attended this. And thank you once again to everybody online. And thank you for the organizers and for people who facilitated this. Thank you very much.